Good evening, I'm Forrest Sawyer, and this is Day One. Tonight, a Day One investigation that took the government by surprise. There's something tobacco companies don't want you to know.
The industry manipulates nicotine, takes it out, puts it back in, uses it as if it were sugar being put in candy.
Why are you artificially spiking your cigarettes with nicotine?
We are not in any way doing that.
Cigarettes, they'll hook you fast, and it's not just an accident of nature.
They don't want anybody looking at their product so that they can doctor it, they can alter it.
A Day One investigation that could change the tobacco industry forever.
From ABC News, Forrest Sawyer, Sheila McVicker, John Hockenberry, Michelle McQueen, John McKenzie, and Lloyd Kramer. This is Day One.
Tonight, a Day One investigation that could completely transform the tobacco industry. It was back in 1964 that the Surgeon General declared cigarettes to be hazardous to your health. After that, cigarette companies were forced to change the way they labeled and advertised their product. It was the biggest challenge the powerful cigarette industry had ever faced, until now. For nearly a year, Day One has been investigating nicotine, the ingredient in cigarettes that keeps smokers addicted. And we've discovered that cigarette manufacturers have been carefully controlling levels of nicotine in cigarettes. Late last week, when word of our investigation got out, the Food and Drug Administration announced that it is now considering whether to regulate cigarettes as drugs. And Congress is planning to hold hearings on the issue next month. Hearings that could be the first step toward a ban on cigarettes as they are now manufactured. Now, clearly, the story is just beginning. And this investigation from John Martin is what started the new cigarette war.
From these tobacco fields comes one of the world's most profitable and addictive substances. To many smokers, cigarettes are simply leaves rolled in white paper. In reality, cigarettes are a complex, scientifically engineered product about which little is known publicly.
Do you think the tobacco companies have been open and honest with people about what's in their product?
Absolutely not. In fact, they've done just the opposite. They've basically blocked any attempts for us to give an honest accounting of the American public of the ingredients within the product.
One ingredient contained in these tobacco leaves is known: nicotine. The 1988 Surgeon General's report identified nicotine as a highly addictive drug and said this is why smoking can be as difficult to quit as heroin or cocaine. One of the writers of the report was addiction expert Dr. Jack Henningfield.
The cigarette is essentially the crack cocaine form of nicotine delivery.
Now, a lengthy Day One investigation has uncovered perhaps the tobacco industry's last best secret: how it artificially adds nicotine to cigarettes to keep people smoking and boost profits. The methods the cigarette companies use to precisely control the levels of nicotine is something that has never before been disclosed to consumers or the government. For years, growing and blending tobacco was an art. But about 30 years ago, it began evolving into something quite different.
In Liggett and Meyer's laboratory, modern science makes certain that the smoker gets precisely what he expects to get.
And one thing smokers are supposed to get is nicotine. That was made clear decades ago by a Philip Morris official. He wrote this confidential internal memo. Think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. Think of the cigarette as a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. Think of a puff of smoke as the vehicle of nicotine. It was here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that the manufacturing process began to change. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company pioneered a two-step process to make cigarettes more cheaply and to control the level of nicotine. Step one, it developed reconstituted tobacco, which is made from stalks and stems and other waste that it used to throw away.
The American public doesn't understand that the tobacco, that it's not a natural tobacco leaf. It's so much of the cigarette is so-called reconstituted tobacco. It's a manufactured product.
Don Barrett sued the American Tobacco Company on behalf of a client who has since died of cancer. Barrett discovered a great deal about how cigarettes are manufactured.
They would take the material, the dust, the tobacco dust that fell on the floor, and they would sweep those up, and they would dump them in a big bin, and they would use that to make the so-called reconstituted tobacco.
The processes involved in controlling the nicotine level are company secrets. This former RJR manager asked to be interviewed in Silhouette.
On the average, the currently marketed brands contain about 22% reconstituted tobacco. The cut rate or generic brands typically contain usually about double that.
DayOne commissioned a laboratory analysis that confirmed the industry's heavy use of reconstituted tobacco. In one brand from RJR, it comprised a quarter of the cigarette. In another, about a third. Even though reconstituted tobacco allows the companies to produce cigarettes more cheaply, there are problems. Poor taste and less nicotine. So here's what the companies do in step 2. They apply a powerful tobacco extract containing nicotine and flavor to the reconstituted tobacco. This process, too, is meant to be secret. Of the 5 companies we contacted who supply the extract, only one would talk to us on camera.
The tobacco people are very secretive with what they use. Some of them, I would think, if you ask them whether they use tobacco, they might just say they don't, you know.
Van Nauheis is a vice president of Dr. Mattis Laboratories. He told us how they make this concentrated extract that is rich in nicotine.
You put the solvent on it, whatever solvent it is, water or alcohol, and then just percolate it. And after you percolate it, you concentrate it. It's basically the same if you're having a drip coffee pot. It's kind of a syrupy consistency, you know, like molasses.
Why would the tobacco companies use this nicotine-rich syrup?
They put nicotine in the form of tobacco extract into a product to keep the consumer happy.
They're fortifying the product with nicotine, is that correct?
The waste filler, yes, they are.
Well, as you described that, which I've heard for the first time, it makes my blood boil. Because what they are now selling is not a natural tobacco product which happens to have nicotine in it, but they are selling a nicotine dispenser. And that is quite different.
To try to verify that nicotine is being added to the reconstituted tobacco in cigarettes, we went to the American Health Foundation, a respected research center in Valhalla, New York. At DayOne's request, the foundation separated and then analyzed the reconstituted tobacco portion of several brands of RJR cigarettes. Reconstituted tobacco ordinarily contains 25% or less of the nicotine in regular tobacco. But the samples we tested had up to 70% of the nicotine that would be found in regular tobacco. Bogdan Prokopchik performed the analysis.
No, I was kind of surprised because I expected it to be less. The most likely explanation is that some nicotine has been added either with flavoring agents or by itself.
Why are you adding nicotine to your cigarettes?
We are not in any way doing that.
You're not adding nicotine?
No, we don't do that.
Joseph DiBathese and John Robinson are RJR scientists involved in tobacco research.
You know about tobacco extracts, though?
I do know about tobacco extracts. They're used as flavor materials, and it's very common in the tobacco industry.
Is there nicotine in those?
A water extract of tobacco would have nicotine in it.
How much?
And just like a water extract of the coffee bean would have caffeine in it.
So would this be a little bit or a lot?
It's hard for me to say. I don't know what a little bit or a lot would be. But I think that...
well, how much does it have?
I think any company involved in the manufacture of tobacco and whose consumers are demanding a wide range of tar and nicotine products. They have blending and reconstituted tobacco techniques for reaching those, that range of tar and nicotine in their products.
But how much nicotine is added? The companies control the dosage precisely, according to this former RJR manager.
In commercially sold cigarettes, what percentage of tobacco extract is nicotine?
That really depends on what level the process calls for. In other words, I can say to you, I want it at 1%, I want it at 5%, I want it at 10%, I want it at 50%.
It's this ability to control the exact dosage of nicotine with tobacco extract that is so alarming to Dr. Greg Connolly, a Massachusetts health official.
Tobacco extract is taking nicotine out of tobacco leaf. It's a drug called nicotine. It's a euphemism. It's like calling heroin poppy seed oil. It's a drug, it's a drug, it's a drug.
Publicly, the companies say they are adding this extract just for the flavor. But there is evidence to contradict that. First, an extract industry manager told DayOne cigarette makers also use his product to give reconstituted tobacco a, quote, kick. That kick, he says, comes from nicotine. Second, even RJR's own researchers say they believe nicotine is a primary reason people smoke. They have identified nicotine's effect on the body, its ability to reduce anxiety and increase mental alertness. In this 1992 study, co-authored by RJR's Dr. Robinson, they wrote, "The beneficial effects of smoking on cognitive performance are a function of nicotine absorbed from cigarette smoke." In addition, patents owned by the cigarette companies show they are well aware of the science of dosing and delivering nicotine. According to this 1980 patent obtained by DayOne, Lowe's, the parent company of cigarette maker Lorillard, held the rights to a system that is especially attractive in enriching the nicotine content of reconstituted tobacco. Dr. John Slade, an expert in nicotine addiction, has researched cigarette patents.
My conclusion from looking at this is that the tobacco companies have been doing this for a very long time, of fine-tuning the nicotine content of their products.
LTR Industries, a French subsidiary of Kimberly-Clark, even advertises in a trade journal that its process for treating reconstituted tobacco permits adjustments of nicotine to your exact requirements. There's another way nicotine is added to cigarettes, and it begins, perhaps surprisingly, at docks like this one in Newark, New Jersey. It is here that nearly pure nicotine is brought ashore to be combined with alcohol. It's called denaturing. The mixture can then be applied to tobacco during the manufacturing process for, among other things, flavoring. As these trucking records show, Philip Morris, for example, received thousands of gallons of this alcohol mixture during the 1980s. The cigarette makers say this mixture leaves only a tiny amount of nicotine on the tobacco. Still, any kind of nicotine manipulation disturbs critics like Cliff Douglas of the American Cancer Society.
The public doesn't know that the industry manipulates nicotine, takes it out, puts it back in, uses it as if it were sugar being put in candy. They don't have a clue.
Neither, apparently, do members of Congress.
Well, it disgusts me.
Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't. They don't want anybody looking at their product. And the reason is exactly what you just went through, so that they can doctor it, they can alter it, they can do anything with it, and they can literally jeopardize the health of the American public without having any consequence.
The tobacco industry boasts that it makes cigarettes with various yields of nicotine, as demonstrated over the years when it tests them on a machine like this one. The industry says the availability of low-tar, low-nicotine cigarettes gives consumers a choice.
Scientifically, the low-tar, low-nicotine cigarette notion is basically a scam.
Jack Henningfield of the National Institute of Drug Abuse argues that these low yields, for the most part, are attained not by removing nicotine, but rather by using filters and air holes. But smokers get around this, he said.
They take a few extra puffs, they inhale a little bit more deeply, they beat the machine. They beat the cigarette, they get all the nicotine their body needs to maintain addiction.
Actually, if the companies wanted to take out all the nicotine, they could.
The truth is you could take all the nicotine out right now in cigarettes and sell them, couldn't you?
We have not done that.
But you could do it.
Well, as scientists and engineers here in R&D, I think that could be done. But I think the real issue here is that we, as a company, are providing a legal product to people who are looking for a pleasing sensory experience with mild pharmacology.
So why don't cigarette makers take the nicotine out of cigarettes?
Because they wouldn't sell cigarettes. If cigarettes didn't give you a bang, they wouldn't sell them.
Philip Morris knows this from its own experience. In 1991, it test-marketed Next, a denicotized cigarette that it withdrew from the market because, without nicotine, few smokers would buy it. How tobacco companies manipulate nicotine and their reluctance to take it out strongly suggests that they want smokers to get nicotine, and they want them to get it in controlled doses. Several months ago, when we tried to get a reaction about all this from the Food and Drug Administration, the agency declined comment, but immediately sent out investigators to look into the matter on their own. Then, learning of our Day One broadcast tonight, the FDA sent out this letter on Friday. Quote, "Evidence brought to our attention is accumulating that suggests the cigarette manufacturers may intend that their products contain nicotine to satisfy an addiction. That's why the FDA says it may have the legal basis on which to regulate these products."
If the industry could put nicotine into Nabisco shredded wheat and get compulsive breakfast eaters, I'm sure they'd do it.
But they can't, of course. That's because nicotine is regulated in every other form, including nicotine patches and nicotine gum, which people use to quit smoking. Cigarettes are the exception. That's because the tobacco industry has been highly successful in getting Congress to protect it from regulation, according to Dr. Conley, the Massachusetts health official.
They exempted the cigarette from the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, Controlled Substances Act, Toxic Substances Act, Consumer Product Safety Act. Every major piece of health legislation since 1964 has had a specific exemption for cigarettes.
The lobby of tobacco is probably one of the most pervasive lobbies in Washington, D.C. Wherever two members of Congress are gathered together, you can probably find tobacco money.
But the FDA has indicated it doesn't need Congress's permission to act, though it wants its guidance. Even without legislation, the FDA believes it already has the legal authority to act on its own. And given the evidence now under consideration, the agency could ban all cigarettes with addictive levels of nicotine. In other words, virtually every single cigarette on the market.
I would think that if I were the administrator of FDA and I learned that nicotine was being added to cigarettes to increase the amount of nicotine present, that I would view that cigarette as a delivery device for the use of nicotine, which is, under ordinary circumstances, a prescription drug. And I would think that demanded regulation.
John, this is really a remarkable story, but regulation's a very big word. When they talk about regulating the cigarette industry, what do we mean?
It means that the cigarettes would have to be certified as safe and effective as any other drug is by the Food and Drug Administration.
What about the cigarettes being sold today? Can they be certified?
Many of them could not because they have higher levels of nicotine than the Surgeon General has said is addictive, and certainly the FDA would have them banned on the market.
Remarkable. What does the tobacco industry say about all this?
Well, they say they're not really adding nicotine, that they're moving it from one part of the tobacco product to another. And they presumably could offer a cigarette that is simply the leaf and not this reconstituted filler material. However, that would raise the amount of nicotine, and it probably wouldn't help them avoid regulation.
Well, obviously, there's a lot more to come here. You're still working on this story.
We're going full speed ahead this week.
And we will watch for that next development next week. John Martin, thanks very much. Good evening. I'm Forrest Sawyer, and this is Day One. Tonight, do you really know what's in that cigarette?
There are chemicals in tobacco products that are so toxic, they wouldn't be allowed in a landfill under the federal environmental rules.
Last week, we brought you new evidence of how tobacco companies are manipulating nicotine in cigarettes to keep smokers smoking. Now, there's more the cigarette companies don't want you to know.
The tobacco industry is the only industry in this entire nation that is permitted to put chemicals and other additives into its product without first proving that those chemicals are safe and effective.
Cigarettes and their secret ingredients. The investigation continues.
Day One. From New York, Forrest Sawyer.
We begin tonight with our continuing investigation into cigarettes and what's inside them. Now we've uncovered what the government has known for years, that there are ingredients in cigarettes that are potentially toxic. It's known because it's had a list of all the ingredients added to cigarettes, yet it has done nothing about it. Last week we reported evidence that tobacco companies are carefully controlling the nicotine levels in cigarettes, and that investigation got the attention of many people, including the head of the Food and Drug Administration. Just before our broadcast last week, the FDA issued a letter saying it's considering whether to regulate tobacco products as drugs. The FDA even suggested that cigarettes, as they are now manufactured, could be taken off the market. As it turns out, that was just the beginning of our investigation. John Martin has startling new information about your cigarette's ingredients and why they've been secret for so long.
It was a long time coming for anti-smoking advocates. After years of frustration, they are suddenly hopeful, calling members of Congress.
I'm calling to talk to you about what the FDA is planning to do in light of what's happening. I just wanted to kind of give you an update.
The dam has broken and the floodwaters are spilling out, and we're trying to respond as best we can.
Last week, DayOne reported for the first time evidence that cigarette companies manipulate levels of nicotine, a highly addictive drug, to keep people smoking. We found manufacturers add nicotine in carefully calibrated doses to fortify the tobacco waste products they insert in cigarettes and to replenish nicotine lost in processing.
The public doesn't know that the industry manipulates nicotine, takes it out, puts it back in, uses it as if it were sugar being put in candy. They don't have a clue.
The FDA letter 10 days ago cited evidence suggesting that nicotine is used to satisfy an addiction of some smokers. The cigarette makers deny the charges. They contend nicotine is not even addictive. Besides, they say, they do not increase the nicotine in cigarettes above what is found naturally in tobacco. Following our broadcast, editorial writers started asking questions. A House subcommittee scheduled hearings late this month to examine the industry's use of nicotine. In the Senate, Ted Kennedy asked the General Accounting Office to investigate nicotine manipulation by cigarette companies.
My sense is that if the investigation by the governmental agency provides the Congress and the American people with the facts on this, as brought out during your excellent report, that, I believe, can be the straw that breaks the back of the real power of the cigarette industry.
There's no better example of that power than the story of the list of additives manufacturers put in cigarettes. Under the law, the list is provided to the government, but kept secret from American consumers. What's on the list and what's not on it tell much about the power of the tobacco lobby, its demands for secrecy, and the government's failure to regulate this industry.
Congressman Ron Wyden has seen the list.
We now know that there are chemicals in tobacco products that are so toxic they wouldn't be allowed in a landfill under the federal environmental rules.
Even so, consumers can't find out what those chemicals are.
It's a felony offense for me to reveal to you or to the public or to a smoker who is interested what ingredients are actually included in tobacco.
Michael Erickson heads the Federal Office of Smoking and Health. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. He knows what additives are in cigarettes because each year tobacco companies are required by law to give him the list. He, in turn, can share that list only with certain government officials. Why? Brennan Dawson represents the cigarette companies for the Tobacco Institute.
The industry, like any other industry of consumer products, wants to make sure that those things that are trade secrets are kept as trade secrets.
Well, a lot of the food products that we see have ingredients, and they list the ingredients. Sometimes they even list the percentage of ingredients.
And in that list of ingredients, you'll see words like flavorings, where the manufacturers are not required to, in fact, turn over what can only be termed a recipe.
I don't think anyone's asking for the recipe.
The manufacturers provide the list to the federal government.
Could the President of the United States look at the list if he wanted to see it?
He would probably have to be designated as an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services to look at the list.
Ron Davis was Michael Erickson's predecessor running the Office of Smoking and Health.
I think it's absurd that a product that's used by 45 million Americans is used by those people without them knowing what's in the product.
The list of additives is so secret that Dr. Davis was required to keep it under lock and key.
Outside my office, the director's office, was the safe.
The safe?
The safe. It usually took me 3 or 4 minutes to get into the safe. It's not just the normal lock where you have to turn to 3 different numbers.
The Office of Smoking and Health, now headed by Dr. Erickson, is located here in Atlanta. When DayOne asked to videotape the safe, the staff member assigned to show us around wouldn't even tell us in which locked room it was located. When we asked him why, this was his response.
Can you tell me why you can't show it to us?
I will lose my job. This has the sound of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons. Need to know. How can that be compatible with a health organization that's trying to protect the citizens?
It implies that our society will be irreparably damaged if somehow people find out what the cigarette companies are putting in cigarettes, which is absurd.
So, what is actually on the list? As many as 700 additives to cigarettes. Dr. Erickson offered one clue about what he called a special category.
There were 13 ingredients that are not allowed to be added to food, but which are added to cigarettes.
DayOne has learned that 2 of those 13 additives should have tipped off the government to the tobacco industry's manipulation of nicotine in cigarettes. Those 2 ingredients are tobacco extract, which frequently is rich in nicotine, and nicotine sulfate, or salt. The list has contained these items for at least 2 years, yet the government did nothing about them.
It's inexcusable that government scientists haven't acted before now to take strong action demanding that that nicotine either be removed or that regulatory authority over tobacco products be expanded. It's inexcusable.
The government just didn't do its job, is what you're saying.
The government just didn't do its job is absolutely correct.
We called around Washington to find out why the list was apparently ignored by the people who could have done something with it. The Surgeon General, on the job 6 months today, hadn't been briefed on the list. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, who technically receives the list, has the authority to warn the country about dangerous ingredients, but never has. The law firm that compiles the list for the large tobacco companies declined to talk on camera. Until now, the idea here in Washington seems to have been worry about the smokers, but spare the tobacco companies.
The cigarette industry reminds me very clearly of the National Rifle Association. The power of an industry of extraordinary corporate wealth and influence.
How did this list come about in the first place, and why is it secret? For years, what health advocates really wanted was a law requiring a list of ingredients on every pack of cigarettes. But the tobacco companies resisted. So about 10 years ago, in a compromise arranged through Congress, the companies agreed to give the government the list, but not consumers. It was up to the government to do something with the list, but it never did.
The public health community demanded of the government scientists that they do something with that list, or if they didn't have the resources to do it, that they publish the list so that those of us in the private sector could do the research. Nonetheless, DHHS every year said, no, it's our responsibility, we can't release the information, and we'll get to it when we have time. They never found the time.
Why wasn't Congress rushing to use the list to learn more about a product that kills 400,000 Americans every year? Ask Dr. Sidney Wolfe, a leading public health advocate.
One would have to look at the 30 years since the Surgeon General's report and say the tobacco industry has had nearly perfect victory record in terms of defeating any kind of legislation that's come across. And the way in which they've done it is by buying up members of Congress.
A study by Dr. Wolfe showed the tobacco industry gave millions of dollars in campaign contributions to Congress, to tobacco state members and key leaders. Among the top recipients, Senate Minority Leader Bob Dole, House Majority Leader Richard Gephardt, and House Ways and Means Chairman Dan Rostenkowski. The tobacco lobby also taught public figures that taking on tobacco can be dangerous to your political health. Joseph Califano was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in Jimmy Carter's cabinet when he attacked the cigarette makers.
It ultimately cost me my job as Secretary
secretary of HEW. I remember Senator Kennedy said to me, there's no way the president can run for re-election with you in the cabinet. Speaker O'Neill told me that. But I want to say something important about President Carter. Since then, he has talked to me, and indeed he said to me, you were right and I was wrong about cigarettes.
Califano says the FDA's announcement that it might regulate cigarettes indicates that Commissioner David Kessler may lead a turnaround inside the government.
I wish that when I had been secretary, we had been imaginative enough and thoughtful enough and aggressive enough to do what he did in his stand on nicotine and in what I think will spark now major congressional activity.
And as far as I'm concerned, what needs to be done next is to make that list public. The public has a right to know.
That, in turn, could force the tobacco industry to do something it has never before been required to do.
The tobacco industry is the only industry in this entire nation that is permitted to put chemicals and other additives into its product without first proving that those chemicals are safe and effective.
All of this means the tobacco companies may also face new challenges in court. If juries decide the companies are intentionally addicting people, smoking victims could claim hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Until now, the cigarette companies have managed to protect themselves from lawsuits, from regulators, and especially from Congress. But that may be changing.
In order to make progress in terms of legislation, you have to have that real support of the American people, that a willingness to override the power of the special interests. And that is going to be the basic question, whether we'll be able to get that kind of support.
Hi, I'm calling from the American Heart Association, and I was hoping that I could come in and talk to you about a bill that we've been working on with Congress.
Well, John, let's focus on this secret list. I want to be clear about it. It has been in government hands for really a very long time.
For 8 years for us, the tobacco companies have been dutifully turning it over to the government for 8 years.
So then why haven't government researchers sat down with the list and started going over it to find out exactly what it is all about?
Ron Davis, who headed that office, told me that he asked for the money. They had estimated it would cost $500,000 to $1 million to analyze all those additives and to come up with a real report. He was told it's not a priority, we don't have the funds for it.
Well, you know that there are an awful lot of independent people who would like to have a chance to sit down and pore over it. Is there any possibility that the public is going to be able to see what's really on this thing?
There is one possibility, and it's being talked about in Congress. Some in Congress are thinking of stepping onto the floor of the House and simply reading the list one by one, about 700 items, into the congressional record.
Good report, John, and you've got more to come. John Martin, thanks very much. We'll be back in just one moment.